Hi everybody, I'm Adam Steele and this is Hop Pole Studios. Today's tutorial is going to be about mastering. Mastering in the digital realm, mastering specifically using Ozone by iZotope as our main kind of foundation. So as well as giving you the technicals of this does this, this does that, I'm going to talk about mastering in general, what it is, what it isn't, and how you can use these tools to approach a good master on a mix. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about before we turn around and use the computer screens, bring up the screen for you and show you an actual master start to finish, I wanted to quickly talk about what is a master, because I think this is very important to what we're about to do. Mastering, in the dictionary definition pretty much, is finalizing a song ready to be released, published in different destination formats. So that means if it's going out on iTunes, or if it's going out on a CD, maybe it's going out on vinyl, maybe it's going out on a cassette. Those all have different limitations to those mediums, and that means that you need to treat the sound you've been given in different ways. The ideal master, especially for a digital release, is that you get given a digital mix and you basically turn that up a little so that it's the right kind of level, and that's it, you're done. In the real world though, that's never really the case. So that's where plugins like Ozone come in, because generally speaking what we want to do at the mastering stage is take a mix that the mixing engineer is happy with, whether that's you who's done the mix or somebody else, and we want to make changes to that to make it sound on par with radio ready releases or other formats, so that it sounds right on that format without it sounding like the mastering engineer has done anything at all. That's the difficult part, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So let's turn around, look at the screen, and talk you through the process of what I would do for a master. Okay, so just a heads up, this is going to be quite a long one, because mastering is deeper than a lot of people think it is. It's one of my favourite things to do, but it's what I would describe as a real magical black art. So let's just save this first, because that's always a good thing to do. Mastering tutorial. And I already loaded up Ozone onto the first track. This is Reaper if you've not used Reaper before, but you can do this in Pro Tools, you can do this in Cubase, you can do it in pretty much any modern DAW. Any digital audio workstation that supports VST or AAX, which is Pro Tools standard, will run Ozone, which means that you'll be able to do so much, if not all, of the stuff we're going to talk about here. So I'm using Ozone 8 Advanced, which is a little more than most people need, to be quite honest with you. There are a few things that you can do in the advanced version that you can't do in the standard version, and I'm actually going to avoid using them today because you don't need most of those features as someone who's a regular mastering engineer. They are really nice to have. Things like the vintage EQ, the vintage tape, the vintage compressor, and the codec thing, which is kind of cool and lets you hear how a file's going to sound when it's converted to like MP3 or iTunes AAC format, and actually lets you hear the difference between MP3 and wave, all that kind of thing. It actually shows you the differences, which is kind of funky, but to me, largely pointless. Largely pointless, not completely pointless. So today we're going to be talking about some of the more basic, but essential and really useful functions of what Ozone does. So the first thing we're going to need to do is get our file, our song, and we're going to do mastering on one song today. Just to talk about everything, prove a point, but most of this will work on all genres and it'll work across albums, which I'll brush upon later on, but I won't go into crazy detail over. So this, if I can find all the files, there's the folders. So the final mix is this, is what I would do at the mastering stage. So before we even talk about Ozone, the mixes for this particular album were done. This was a remote mix that I did. I mixed for a band who were working at 44 kilohertz, 24-bit. So that's the sample rate that I mixed at, because there's no point chopping and changing. And so when I did the mixes, I made them as 24-bit waves with no mastering, quote unquote, applied to the actual mixes, because that kind of defeats the purpose. And then you can see here, I made a CD master, a Spotify master, a streaming master in MP3 format already, basically, so that if any platforms that these guys are working with insist on being given an MP3, which sometimes happens, I can make sure they can give them the highest quality, and a DDP, which is something that's a little more fancy and is something that you would only do if you are mastering to go to a CD pressing plant. So let's pull in one of these mixes and we'll do a master of one of these. So let's have a look. Which one was my favourite in the end? Give Me a Sign was the first single off this album. I think that's already been released. So if we see the wave file here, if we look beyond Ozone, it's got some big spikes, and that's the big spiky snare drums and kick drums. It's not absolutely mashed in terms of volume. And if I make sure my volume's right, let's hear it. Okay, so the balance on the mix sounds good. On reflection now, having finished the mix is overall maybe a little thin sounding. The snare is louder than everything, but that's quite a common rock and metal mixed thing because of something we'll brush upon very soon, where when you make something really, really loud as a mix, transients tend to get buried, transients being the hits. And so what you want to do to compensate for that is you want to make sure that things that need a loud hit are louder than they should be, so that then when everything's made loud and those things get buried a little, it comes out nice and even. So if we hit play on this and watch Ozone now, we can see that this is the maximiser, and this is the first window that iZotope draws us to. And so the first thing that I want to do when I'm talking about mastering is I want to stop right now. I've got my files in the project. If I had several songs, I would line them all up here. I might have them on separate tracks and then routed through a group so that I could put Ozone on the group and then maybe EQ them separately. Which is, again, something we'll brush upon later on. But at this point, I would stop. And what I would do, if I hadn't already given myself a bit of rest after mixing, that's the first thing I would do. Just some silence, some peace, some quiet. And what I would do here is I might check my emails. I might go on Facebook for a little while. I might read a magazine. Whatever it is that I'm going to do, I want to make sure that I'm in silence for a little while, just so that I can calibrate my brain. Everything that's been forced at me while I've been mixing, I want to have a very clear, calm head. Because mastering, especially mastering your own work, can be quite difficult, because the aim for me is to have a second opinion, which is very difficult to do for your own work because you're so deep into that. And so a good piece of advice at this point is try not to do mastering on your own mixes if you can help it. If you've got a friend who's also a music producer, a mixing engineer, mastering engineer, I wholeheartedly suggest that both of you get to a level with mastering where you feel confident with it. Maybe both watch this tutorial, wink, 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 and Then send each other your mixes and do the mastering on each other's work. You'll find this is very healthy, very good, because this then gives you a second perspective. If you're working on your friend's mix, then you can objectively listen to it and go, yeah, this track's cool, but there's too much kick drum, or there's not enough mids overall, or whatever it may be. You're going to listen to it much more objectively, and you're going to go, oh, that's not what I would have done. And the other thing, aside from that, is I'm going to use this word over and over and over again, and this word is reference. Referencing, to me, is one of the most important things that a mastering engineer will do in their day, because you need to be grounded mentally, hearing-wise. You need to be clear and have a frame of reference, because the whole point of mastering is to get your tracks, album, whole release to sound like it belongs in the upper echelons of music, in whatever genre it may be, whether it's rock, whether it's metal, whether it's hip-hop, whether it's pop. It needs to tonally and volume-wise be in the same ballpark as your contemporaries. And so how do you do that? You listen to your contemporaries. You listen to the music that they've produced, at the very least, producers in that field that you really look up to and respect. And you go, you know what, this mix, this master, to me, sounds amazing. This is, even if the artist you're working with doesn't actually sound like that and doesn't want to sound like that other artist that you look up to, the point here is tone. So the point here is the right amount of volume for your track, the right amount of sub bass, the right amount of lower mids, the right amount of sibilance on the top end, the right amount of stereo width. Those kind of things where we're not talking about, like, say hip hop, say you're a rapper and you've got a great beat, and you think that Kanye West's recent album was the best sounding album that's been put out in that genre in 10 years, let's say. But you don't want to be Kanye. You don't want to sound like Kanye, because who can? As an example, that's fine, because from a mastering context, we're not trying to make you into Kanye. We're just trying to say, right, well, his mixes were this loud, his mixes had this much bass, his mixes were this wide stereo-wise. And if our mixes have that much of those, we will be on that playing field, even if we're a completely different artist, completely different, state of mind, that kind of thing. The same goes for rock and metal. I tend to find that references for mixes from the last 5 years or so are very important to have. Where it doesn't matter if you really like older albums. Older albums from, I don't know, the 80s or the 90s probably don't have the volume of modern stuff, which means that your mixes wouldn't compete. They might not have as much bass because the older albums might have been mastered for vinyl, which is something we might brush upon later, where vinyl can't handle a lot of ultra low end. The needle skips. That's the kind of thing where you've got to be careful what references you pick. And so the first thing that I would say is, grab a song or an album that you want tonally to sound like, and just listen to that for a while. At a reasonable volume, not crazy loud, so that you can be objective and you can go, this album sounds great at a medium kind of volume. Why does it sound great at a medium kind of volume? Rather than just having it super loud and then going, yeah, that's great, because then all your perspective is lost, especially in mastering. So, without further ado, let's cut back to this track and our reference. If we look at Ozone 8's bottom right, there is a button that says reference. And this is a new thing in Ozone 8, and I think this is fantastic. This has saved me some time, some routing. This has saved me quite a lot of messing around where I used to have a separate track in my DAW with the reference on it, muted, making sure that didn't go through any of the processing. What this does is this allows you to load in a file of pretty much any format you can think of within reason. Although, of course, lossless, so WAV or FLAC files are definitely preferred for this. And it will split it into chunks, the song, and then you can choose a chunk and it will just loop round and round. And as soon as I press this button for on and off, that will turn on the reference track without any of your mastering effects applied to it. So just the straight reference track. And then you click it again and it turns it off, and your track with all this mastering processing is now back. So you can very quickly go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So what we're going to do now, and this is a little bit naughty. I don't think you should do this at all. This is generally a bad thing, but I kind of have to do this. Is I'm going to use as a reference one of my own masters. Now, why would I do that? The only reason that I would do that is because this is going out on YouTube. This is being broadcast. And as such, if I was to put a song in by a band like, say, Judas Priest, who were actually the reference that I used for this album, the copyright gods of YouTube would absolutely rain on my parade. And they would then take any revenue from this video from now until the end of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the CD master and I'm going to pick a different song from the album just so that it's not really, really weird. And I'm going to pull that up as the reference. Now this is loaded in and you can see there are different sections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of these B sections. I think that's a verse. I'm going to turn the volume down and I'm going to hit play.
What is it? You're obsolete.
Cool. So now if I turn the reference on and off, the one that goes obsolete, that's our reference. And the one that says, give me a sign, that's our mix. So let's listen backwards and forwards from the reference to the mix.
You're obsolete. When you
Okay, so that's great. We have a reference now. We don't need to look at this window anymore. So I'm going to click the word reference. And that's now, if I just turn on reference on and off, that's going to bring up that reference without me going back to that window at any point. And I think that's really, really useful. So the first thing that I was hearing there, and you'll hear it again, I'll hit play again. Is that our mix is way quieter than the master we're comparing it to. Now that's perfectly normal because masters, generally speaking, are quite loud. CD masters now, in my experience, more so than iTunes, Spotify, digital streaming masters, and that's something we'll talk about later on. So the first thing that we'll do, we're on the maximiser. So I'm going to kind of work backwards. What I'm going to do first is bring the volume of our mix up so that that then matches the reference, roughly, because otherwise any changes we do, EQ-wise, compression-wise, anything like that, it's going to mess with our heads because anything that's louder automatically sounds better to us. That's just the way the human ear works. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the level of our unmastered mix so that the two are roughly the same, and then we'll start to hear, as a very direct comparison, whether one sounds different tonally from the other. So the first thing that I'm going to do is where it says mode on the left, we need to pick a maximizer mode, and I always pick IRC4, which is the most clean, transparent maximizing limiter that Ozone currently has, which means that if we start to hit that limiter, there's a lot more chance that we won't hear anything nasty in there. We won't start to hear distortion and other horrible artifacts. Generally speaking, we don't want to hit that maximizer too much, which is something we'll come back to with the dynamics. But in this case, it's something that's going to happen every now and again. Probably more often than not on those big snare hits that we were hearing. So, the first thing now we've chosen that is we'll hit play, and the threshold I'm going to bring down quite a bit. And as the threshold goes down, the maximizer is going to bring up that level and is going to push the level out.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
Okay, so I'm nearly at a minus 10 decibels of threshold here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit play and I'm going to use that reference and go, is our mix louder, is our mix quieter? Time to reference.
Religion. Putting faith at ease. Praying to a God.
Okay, so volume-wise, they're fairly similar. Now, the next thing that I've got to talk about is this red light right here. We are very much on the verge of clipping, and that can be very, very bad. In what we need to do is we need to have a ceiling, and what the ceiling will do is it will basically say the mix, the master, will never get above this level. And what that does is when you play back a CD or an iTunes, Spotify, whatever master, even though there's a volume limit, because usually it's compressed, when it's uncompressed, there are volume spikes that jump out. If the level's too loud, that will then sound distorted and will sound disgusting. So what we want to do is we want to bring this ceiling down. The absolute minimum I recommend for a CD master is minus 0.3, and generally speaking now I go to minus 1 decibel. It's only 1 dB, but it means that there's a very good chance that when you play back a really loud mix, that it's going to sound much cleaner when it's then played back on whatever system you're playing it on. And cleaner means clearer. Clearer means more impact, more perceived volume, less nastiness and harshness in the ears. And there's a button here which I'm going to press, which is True Peak. And that's a very clever extra layer, which should stop any of the compressed audio, in theory at least, from then being too loud when it's decoded. So if I hit play now,
What is religion? Your obsolete belief when you are praying.
cool. So it sounds like the master reference was a bit louder now because of that ceiling. So I've pushed the threshold a little more, and we can see the character is the next thing that tends to affect how it sounds. I tend to leave that where it is because 2.0, especially for rock and metal, seems to be relatively clean sounding, gives you plenty of attack without being absolutely crazy. If I hit play again, you'll see these little dips here.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
And you'll notice, if this is perfectly synchronized, that that's on the kick and snares going bum bum di, bum bum di, so that every time they hit, we are guaranteed that they will make way for themselves in the mix. But the mix is very, 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 very instantaneously dipped down just to accommodate for that. It's almost the equivalent of a lot of older engineers using bus compression. It's not the most ideal way, but it's something that I've found works quite well for rock and metal. This red light, now I'm going to click that just to clear it, and if I hit play,
What is religion?
that now doesn't light up, which means it's not going to clip, it's not going to hit digital maximum, which means that our sound should be, in theory, as good as it's going to get. So, the next couple of controls here, which I'm very briefly going to talk about, are stereo independence. I like to have this up at maybe 50% so that if a particularly loud sound happens in one ear, let's say there's a floor tom that absolutely goes for some part of the song, and that's quite appropriate. If that's hitting the limiter without the stereo independence, both channels are going to dip, and that's going to sound really weird and make you feel a little bit seasick. So I like to have stereo independence on the transient and sustain there, just so that if anything like that does happen, it happens more on one side than the other, and it stops you from feeling too dizzy and kind of off balance. I quite like having a little bit of stereo stuff going on. It's something that Andrew Sheps does. He's a very, very famous mixing engineer, and so if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. The very last control is transient emphasis. Now, let's say that you got sent a mix where the kick and the snare, they're sat just about right, but when it all gets quite loud, they're starting to get just a little bit lost. You can tick this button and then bring that up, and what that will do is it will alter the way the maximizer works to let those transients through more. Because I've made a mix, or the mixing engineer's made a mix that has plenty of snap and punch on those kicks and snares, if I have this on, it will actually overbear. It will be too much. In fact, let's just give you a quick example all the way up. So without it, and then
Religion, putting faith in your belief. When you are praying, you a God that you can't see.
so there is definitely some room for interpretation there, and it depends on whose mix and master you are referencing against. If you need a little bit more hit and punch right at the very end when everything else sounds perfect, just turn on the transient emphasis, just bring it up until it's right, and again, keep referencing every time, because the reference is the thing that's going to keep you grounded. If you then go, like, say I got this threshold and just went 20, that's fine, that's so loud, that's going to be great, and then I referenced it against a track, and this radio ready release wasn't nearly as loud as my track, that should make me stop and think that I'm probably damaging the sound here, which means that the radio ready stuff is at that volume for a reason. Why am I killing it? And that's a good way to keep you grounded, to make sure that you don't go absolutely bananas and kill it. In this way, you can end up with some very good, very punchy mixes and masters, and if it still doesn't sound loud enough to you, you probably need to turn up the speakers, or it could be that you've got an EQ balance problem, which is what we're going to talk about next. So with the maximizer set, where was it, minus 10.7, so with everything here how I would like it, we might still come back here later and change a couple of things, because as we change the EQ balance, as we add things in, that might just affect things where we need to nip back here and just make small adjustments, but most of the work in the maximizer is now done. I wanted to pause quickly at this point to talk about what happens when your master is finished. When you've got your mix done, you've got your masters done, they're ready for release, especially digitally, what do you do? What's next? And so, I wanted to talk to you about DistroKid. DistroKid are someone we've worked with recently. We work with them quite a bit now. I've recently just released my own album and soon a covers album through DistroKid, and that's now available on Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, all the regular platforms, and even the small stuff, which is great. It means that people can search for me, Adam Steele, and my stuff, and it's there. And it's not particularly expensive. One of the things that struck me about DistroKid is that if you're a one person, one artist, or one band, you sign up for $19.99 for the year, and that's it. If you put out an unlimited number of releases, they don't charge you any extra money to do so. There are a couple of extra things that you can pay extra to do, like you can have your music so that Shazam and Siri can actually detect what your song is. You can have the guys at DistroKid distribute your music on YouTube so that if anyone else uses your track, rather than you having to reach out and do all the copyright stuff, the money just automatically will go to you. There's pretty cool little details like that. If you want to release covers, in the past it used to be that you used to have to secure licenses for thousands of dollars, and now you can do it through DistroKid at $1 a month. Done. They get the license, sorted. Makes your life easy. So if you're interested in that now that your track is mastered, check out the link in the description below, because we have a link to DistroKid that gives you an extra few % off and helps us out in the process. So check that link out in the description below. Back to the tutorial. So we work backwards now. So the equalizer. You'll have seen equalizers, you'll have seen EQs in different plugins. What makes this one special? Well, mastering EQs, equalizers, to me are designed with a very different purpose in mind. And that is to say, they're designed so that, generally speaking, you don't hear them. That makes them very processor intensive, it makes them very demanding, but they also can be very, very helpful. Now, like if you've got an EQ, say a stock EQ in Pro Tools or something like that, if I was to draw a shape like that, that might be 12 decibels of boost. That might be huge, whereas in this, that was only 3.5 dB. So a very, very relatively small amount of difference. That's what you really should be looking for at the mastering stage. You should be looking to make small changes to fix small problems. If you've got a big problem with the EQ of a mix or the overall balance, the best thing to do is talk to the mix engineer and just say, hey buddy, I'm listening back to this and I think there's way too much of, I don't know whether it's a bass instrument, a kick drum, or just low ending. Communicate with them, because getting something fixed at the mix stage I find is far beneficial to trying to rescue it at the master stage. The master should be the smallest, most final part. If you have absolutely no choice, however, let's say it's a song that was produced where all the original files have been lost, the producer's work has been burned, maybe it's on an old master tape and that's it, it's some old restoration job and there is literally no other way, it is what it is, then this is where this will come in more. So, let's hit play on this and do the reference thing again.
What is really your obsolete when you are praying to a God that you can't see?
Okay, so you see that bouncing meter? That's called an FFT. And what that is a brief snapshot of a rough EQ of how your song is sounding from moment to moment. And it is from moment to moment, so you have to take that in context. Context is very important. Let's say you have kind of a breakdown in the middle of a song where there's supposed to be loads of bass, there's not supposed to be a heavy guitar. Suddenly, there's going to be a big dip in the middle because all that guitar's gone, and that's okay for that section because context is important. I find that mastering is quite... it's a good example, rock and metal, because rock and metal tend to have very full EQ spectrums. They tend to have a lot going on from maybe 60 Hz all the way up beyond 10K. And if we look at this, hit play, you'll see it's fairly full all the way up.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying to a God that you can't see.
And you can see that going up and down. And something that we can do, if we can hear, compared to our reference, that something isn't right in the mix, this is where Ozone's EQ is very, very useful. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit play and then I'm going to hold down Alt on my keyboard. If you're on a Mac, if you're on OS X, it's a different key. I can't remember if it's Option or if it's the Apple key. But if you hold one of these down, you'll find what I'm doing very quickly. It's on the bottom row. And it will isolate whatever frequency my mouse is clicking on that EQ, which means that I can very quickly listen in and zero in on problem frequencies. So let's say that something was going wrong in the low mids and I couldn't quite work out what. If I hit play and then hold down Alt and listen.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying to a God that you can't see. A losing battle. How can you justify?
So let's say I found a problem here at 600 hertz, it gives me the exact number that I was at the bottom of this EQ. So let's then find that 628 or so, 628, and then take the gain down a little just to get rid of some of that problem.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
So that was only a decibel of difference that I did there, but at mastering, that can be quite important. That can be the difference between something sounding like it's got a kind of a radio effect on it and sounding right. And if the overall balance of the mix was right, but it just had a build-up in a certain area, this is a great way to just fix that outright. If I play and just listen to some of the real sub stuff, I'm hearing, and I've got a full double subwoofer setup here, so I can hear some real low end. I'm hearing that there's a bit of a problem where there's a bit of extra wah, 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 below 30 hertz, which most speaker systems are not going to be able to do. So what I really want is to get rid of pretty much everything in a rock and metal mix below about 30 hertz. This will mean that I'm able to then push the rest of the level up a bit more, not damage people's speakers, not cause a subby, flabby mess, and still have quite a clean sounding mix. So what I want a high pass on band number 1. That now looks absolutely crazy extreme. So what we want to do is change this to a brick wall, because a brick wall literally says below this frequency, nada, we are not having anything. And I'll bring that frequency down to about 30 hertz. This is, again, quite a common mastering technique, is anything that's not needed below a certain frequency, get rid, because that can really help to clear out the rest of the room so that the actual bass can really come through, and so that your mix isn't volume limited by all that extra energy that was down the bottom that you did not need. So this shouldn't, unless you've got like really good headphones or a subwoofer system, sound any different. But I'm going to turn this band on and off.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief.
Now, something that's interesting to me is that doesn't sound much different, but watch these meters where it says RMS up here, the output for the RMS. If I turn this band off, you'll notice it hovers around -8 dB RMS. If I turn this band on, it hovers around -9 dB RMS, which means that we've actually cleared out an entire decibel's worth of volume that we weren't seeing the benefit of. That means that, in theory at least, our CD master should sound cleaner and clearer, less chance of distortion, and yet we don't audibly hear any useful information being lost. So I'll just watch this meter again where it says -RMS, the band's off.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
Okay, so it's kind of hard to keep track there, but I'm certainly thinking that that saved us some energy. If I really want, I could probably bring that frequency all the way up to 40 hertz. Anything from 40 and above, I tend to find that big speakers can actually reproduce.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief.
So this is where the EQ can be very useful. If we're referencing backwards and forwards,
Religion. Putting faith in your belief.
I'm really hearing that there's an upper mid push on that master that I don't have, and it's maybe around 1K. So I'm just going to make that gentle and then just see how this sounds without.
What is religion? Putting faith in your knees. For praying to a God that you can. Throw sin, losing battle. Fail.
Yeah, so that's now pushed the mix forward, I would say, which means that the mids are more present. It means that everything's going to jump out the speakers at you more, which again, for a rock and metal mix is quite a common thing to do. Now, let's get interesting. Let's very quickly talk about mid-side. I'm not going to go crazy in depth about mid-side, but on the left here, there's stereo, MS, and LR. LR is just left-right, so you can have different settings there. I don't tend to use that at mastering unless there's some serious issue going on. But mid-side is something that I do quite a lot, and mid-side is a very clever thing where the signal is split in such a way that the mid is everything that comes right down the middle, and the side is everything that comes out, well, in stereo, as it were. So if you were to turn off the sides, then you would, so if I soloed the mid so you didn't hear the sides, you would suddenly just hear the middle and you'd hear mono. And if I just soloed the sides, it would sound really weird. So here's the mid soloed, because that was the reference and I'm an idiot.
What is religion?
And here's the sides. Okay, so when we switched over to mid-side, what that did is it copied the settings over to the mid, but it didn't copy them over to the side. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put the high-pass brick wall on the sides. But I'm actually going to put that a little further up at 55 Hz, just because I don't think the sides need sub information. They don't need any of that super sub stuff. The middle, you might actually want some of that. So I might actually go back to the mid and just let that back down to, I don't know, 35-ish Hertz. So that if there is anything super sub, it's allowed to exist right in the middle. But at the sides, not so much, because you don't really want stereo super sub stuff. It messes with the rest of the mix. And I was noticing, I'm not going to solo the sides, but that the high gain guitars could have done with standing out a little more, especially in the lower mids. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the low mids, which is 400, 500, 600 Hertz. I'm going to hit play and I'm going to drag that around only on the side channel.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
So now we've got quite a lot more of the side of basically the distorted guitars, and anything that's in huge stereo comes along with that. So I'm going to A-B that with a reference. Now it sounds like I've gone too far, so I'm going to bring that back. Cool. So the sides now have a bit of a push on the guitar. If there wasn't enough high end, I could lift it here. But I've split it into mid-side, which means that if there is too much sibilant on the main vocal in the centre, maybe I could dip a little out on the mid. Maybe if there's a bit much on the cymbals on the sides, I could then go to the sides and take a little bit of that out. This is the kind of thing that you should be doing at mastering. It's very subtle, very gentle kind of tweaks and not crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. So let's move on to the dynamics processor, which shouldn't be doing very much at all.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief when you are praying.
Now, truth be told, I don't use Ozone's dynamics very much. I leave it as it's set by default, usually because that's a good kind of safety net. As you can see, it's pulling back 0.1 decibels or maybe 0.5 off this low mid-range. And all that seems to be doing is if there's too much of a spike in one of these regions, whether it's the bass, the upper mids, treble, it just helps to tame that just a little. But again, opinion time, for me, that should be something that was sorted in the mix. If it's needed, you've got options here for your dynamics. You can change what type of compression you have on each band. You can change ratios of where compression or limited can go. I think that compression is something that's much more of a mix tool, generally speaking, but it's here if you want it. If you've got a very dynamic mix, let's say it's classical, and you just want something to take care of the really big swells so that it doesn't blast the CD through the stratosphere, you can then bring thresholds down so that whatever range, I know it might be, particularly on a classical mix, I don't know, it might be the treble that you just want to make sure the compressor kicks in. If it's getting really scratchy, that's the kind of thing that can help out here with making sure that it's more of a safety net than an artistic compression. The other things that I'm going to talk about here is there is an exciter, which I tend to put just after my EQ. And what the exciter does is that has up to 4 bands of kind of what I would describe as analogness. Now, this is a little harder to explain, but if you've been given a mix where the balance is right, but it all sounds a little bit cold, a little bit clinical, a little bit, for lack of a better word, digital, what you can do is you can add a little bit of kind of like tape saturation, tube saturation, that kind of thing. You don't need to add very much of this, and you can really add some character here. There are a few modes, triode and dual triode, which are trying to replicate specific types of valve saturation. And if they're sounding a little nasty, you hit the oversampling button and that makes them sound a little bit nicer and a bit more realistic. So let's have all these on tape mode. And what you can do, let's just solo this low mid. There's currently no exciting on it at all. The amounts are all at 0, even though the module's turned on. So I can give you a very good idea of what this does. So from 0, I'm going to hit play and I'm going to pull this up quite far.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief. When you are praying to a God that you can't see.
So you probably heard there that as you push it, it really starts to distort and sound quite terrible, to be honest. But what you can do is you can push that just a little, and then same in the low end. If your low end's like, let's say that you've got a mix where the bass is just like, it's a sine wave. It's really pure. It's basically, you can't hear it on any system other than the best systems in the world. What you can do is you can add some saturation of a particular type here that will help to replicate that a little further up, which means that small speakers will then be able to replicate it. So you probably heard again there that if you push it too hard, it really starts to distort. So you've got to be quite careful with this. But let's also do that with the upper mids. And also with the top end. Now this is with all these mixes at 100%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this module and then turn it back on and off as comparison. So without and with.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief. When you are praying to a God that you can't see. A losing battle. How can you justify?
Now that does sound louder, even though the volume hasn't technically been increased. What's happened here is that all this harmonic saturation makes everything appear louder than it was before, perceptually so. The actual volume probably does increase as well, but that's where the dynamics would take care of that. You would have to then bring your maximiser down to compensate for that. To me, this all sounds a little bit fake, probably because I'm pushing it too hard. But in the right circumstances, a little bit of exciting on each band can, I find, give a mix a certain polish that it didn't have before. So with.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief. When you are praying to a God that you can't see.
Do be careful, especially with the higher bands, that if you then excite too much, the top end can suddenly sound quite scratchy and maybe a little bit piercing. It's easy to get carried away with that, and that's where reference comes in. I'll come back to referencing in a minute. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the imager, which again for me goes somewhere way before the maximizer, probably after an exciter if there is one, after an EQ. And what the imager does is it uses some very clever techniques to make separate bands, like we were talking before, the bass, mid, high mid, treble, either more stereo or less stereo. So without touching anything, it should sound exactly the same as before.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief.
So what you can see here, this twitching monster, this is a polar sample graph. And what that's giving us is right down the middle here is any audio that comes through that is perfectly in mono. Anything that goes across this line is anything that comes only out of the left speaker, and anything there comes only out of the right speaker. Now you'll actually notice that there is sound that goes past the left and the right.
What is religion?
And that's stuff that sounds further stereo than perfect left or perfect right, which is entirely possible with phase manipulation. You can actually play with the phase of certain instruments to make them sound bigger. Quite often you find that like heavily affected vocals or super widened stuff tends to come out further than left and right, but that does usually mean that if you listen to something in mono, that can cause some serious issues on its own, which is something that we might talk about later on. So the stereo width, you've got to be very careful with, but what you can do is you can very gently and very subtly just push some of these bands outwards if your mix doesn't feel stereo enough already.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief. When you are praying to a God that you can't see.
Notice how I've gone so far with that now. It actually sounds kind of horrible. Those guitars, they're really popping out, but then they all kind of sound unnatural. So that's what you've really got to be careful of. I tend to find that if I've got a mix where I've hard panned guitars left and right, a little bit of this kind of stereo pushing in the right areas can just help it pop. But then I don't tend to touch the super high end these days. And if anything, I quite often get the low end below where it's like defaulted to 140 Hz, but I might take it down to 100 or so and just make that less wide so that any low bass gets then more mono, which means that the whole stereo image is a little bit more stable. But that depends on how much super low end is in heavy guitars and that kind of thing, because if they're independently going chug 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 on the sides, I might actually want to keep some of that out there to make the guitars sound huge.
What is religion? Putting faith in your belief. When you
Let's do a quick reference again.
putting faith.
I'm going to move on in the song for a bit of a different reference point.
But I cannot see them. You're my life.
Okay, so I'm actually hearing now, after doing all this, that there's a little bit less low end generally, but there will be specific frequencies in our mix than there are in the reference. But I don't want to go crazy and overboard. So what can I do? Because if I start changing the equalizer now, that'll affect the exciter and that'll affect the dynamics. I don't want to do any of that. So how do we do this? This is where the post EQ comes in, which looks, to all intents and purposes, exactly like the other EQ, but it's designed to come later on. It doesn't actually sound, as far as I'm aware, any different, but it means that you can have a subtle change of EQ after all the rest of your processing and leave the other equalizer so that it does things like take the low end out before exciters and stereo images so that we're not damaging these processes, but we've still got room later on before our maximizer to make very subtle final tweaks. So, what I'm going to do here, firstly, I'm going to do absolutely nothing. And this is where this clever little button down here comes in. And this is a button that says matching. So what I'm going to do is, first things first, I'm going to save this tutorial. And I'm going to do something that I used to do before the reference came in. Is I'm going to import this CD master of the song we've been using, which was obsolete. And you see how behind Ozone, that song does look like it's got absolutely smashed volume until we zoom in. And that's because that's how CD masters do tend to look. It's not pretty, but it's kind of a fact of life. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to very quickly turn off all of the processes that come before this post EQ, just for a minute. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a section of this song, and I'm going to capture this as a snapshot. So if I hit play and then capture,
You're obsolete. Goes in to find you. They'll
okay, so that's quite enough of that. I hit stop, and we now have this blue line, which is the target. That's the amount of low end we want. That's the amount of 2K and 4K we want, and then it gently tails off. Again, standard for a rock mix. I did think, I'll just delete that out of the project so it doesn't get confusing. I did think that the mixes that we were referencing against, which were from the most recent Judas Priest album, Firepower, were quite low-end heavy. That album's got quite a lot of a bass going on, slapper the bass, yes. So this big lump here in the low bass is not necessarily common, but that's the thing about referencing, is that we listened to that album between me and the artist I was working with, and we went, that's the sound we want to get to. Even though it's a little bit more bass heavy than perfectly flat, that's where we're going. So that's where it's quite important for me to have a reference, rather than just go with the whole pink noise capture or something like that. I personally think that pink noise mixing isn't the best idea because it doesn't give you anywhere to head to. Anyway, that's getting ahead of myself. I'm going to go back to our mix with all our effects turned back on and hit play and capture the EQ curve of this.
all my life. Questions why? Give me a sign that you are there. Give me
Okay, so now I've got two EQ curves in here. You can see that the yellow one generally looks less loud than the blue one. That's because it's coming in before the maximizer, and that's fine because that makes no real difference to us. Although what is interesting is that even though the top end is less overall, in the 1K, 2K region, I can actually see where they cross over, which tells me our mix that we're working on has a bit too much energy in that region, maybe. We're going to have to use our ears to confirm that. And also where it touches in this 200 region, it's possible we have a little too much going on there and maybe not enough in another region. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on this little standby button that turns this matching that we've just done on. And that EQ curve that we've got is relatively gentle, but I can turn the amount up here just to show you. I mean, I would never have an amount like this that's absolutely crazy, but you can see where it's picked up on what I've picked up on here, that we need a bit less of this 1K area. It's also picked up that we could do with a bit more low mids, which you may remember me dipping them out earlier on, which was definitely for an example, but it's picked up on that in comparison and gone, actually, you should have more of this. It means that we need more in this 150 hertz range of kind of the warm bass. We need less in this 60 hertz-ish range of the sub bass. And we definitely need overall more high end. So if I leave this on, the smoothing just stops it from being a crazy jagged EQ. It can really mess with your sound. We're using this as kind of an overall broad set of brush strokes and using just a little of this. So if we go away from the matching window and leave this on, that's now our EQ curve that's in after the dynamics. So a little bit less of this, a little bit more of this. It's subtle, but especially that 600 hertz that you can actually see. Oh no, that's right. So I went to boost that on the sides and actually, yeah, dip that on the mid, and it's picked that up in comparison and gone, yeah, you should have a little more of this and a little less of this, and definitely more high end. So if I play,
So many we see die. You're obsolete. Why?
okay, so now I'm thinking that this mix comparison isn't loud enough, so I'm going to bring the threshold back up again, and now check my reference.
So many we see die. You're obsolete.
Okay, so our guitars sounded kind of a little weird to me now, and that might be the stereo images going a little crazy, or it might be that the side EQ that we boosted here is a bit too much. So let's take them both back down and compare.
So many we see die. You're obsolete. Christians, why? Ozone to fight.
Now they, to me, I can A-B them and they sound tonally very, very similar. Now, that's no surprise because these are actually from the same album, but if I was doing this with a professional reference like the Judas Priest Firepower song that I keep mentioning, I'd be very happy. And that tends to be round about the end of the mastering process for me. And then we've got the final section, which is what we were talking about is this going on CD, is this going to Spotify and that kind of thing. So let's take the reference off. Let's say that we're now happy with this as our CD master. It's quite loud and we can actually see our maximizer going crazy.
So many we see die. Oh my Lord.
Which is a bit more maximizing than I would generally like, but then CD masters tend to be hotter than I would like. That's to do with the loudness war and that whole argument. So CDs are CDs, and again, in my opinion, that is what CDs are going to sound like now because the bar has been raised. However, one thing we do have to do is CDs have to be 44.1 kilohertz and they have to be 16-bit wave files because that's the format that CD works at. There's no way around that. That's what it is. So at this point, I like to go into the dither settings because dither is a thing that makes lower bit depths sound better than they actually are. It's clever kind of psychoacoustic stuff. Make sure it's on 16-bit, and I tend to leave iZotope's M-bit dither, medium, high, and then the bit meter is just going to show us what's going on.
So many we see die. Oh my.
And that just lets us know that the top bit isn't being used, which is good because we've got that ceiling there, so it's not going to distort. And the dither just adds a little bit of noise that's really, really, really hard to hear, but actually, through clever science and maths, makes everything sound a little bit better. It's very hard to explain, and that might be worth another video. And then at the very end, there's this DC offset. And DC offset is sometimes a problem with a mix you've been sent, especially if it's been transferred off a tape machine or something like that, where the whole wave file is slightly off of zero, and that can cause problems with people's speakers standing off center, which can really cause damage and isn't very nice at all. So what we're going to do there is you can just hit filter, and it just looks for anything that over time is off zero and just pulls that whole section of the master back so that speakers don't get hurt and nobody gets damaged. That's not necessary on a lot of stuff, especially if you're taking out the super duper low end like I am here. That tends to not be a problem, but it can be, and if it is, that's how you fix it in the dither window. If we're mixing for Spotify, that's what we're going to talk about next. So before we do, this is now 16-bit, it's loud, so we've got our files. Let's say there's a fade in and fade out on the song. That's something you would tend to do at mastering. Then you've got things that we won't talk about here, but things like ISRC codes and that kind of stuff. And of course, you need to render these to files or bounds or whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to hit render. It's come up on the wrong screen, so I'm going to bring that to here. make sure that this is exporting the right time selection to the right place. With this being for CD, I want this to be 44.1 kilohertz. If there's a resample mode needed, hopefully there isn't, but if there is, I want it to be extreme quality. Again, that's the kind of thing that in Pro Tools or whatever, you make sure you pick the highest quality. Output format wave, 16-bit PCM is what you want for CD, and then with each file, render, and you're off, you're done. So that's nice and simple. So let's move that back to 24-bit and cancel this. If you were working with vinyl, I'm very quickly going to brush up on that. You probably don't want to have a maximizer engaged at all. You probably want to use a little bit more of the dynamics control than you would a maximizer, because vinyl doesn't have an upper volume limit like CDs and iTunes and Spotify do. But if you have too loud a volume spike, that will cause the needle to jump, and that's definitely something that you don't want. So that's something that's very, very bad. And also, I tend to find that for vinyl, things like this little sub lift here, you definitely don't want. You might find yourself taking more low end out for vinyl than you would otherwise. If I make that high pass, and then just, I don't know, that depends on how loud you want the vinyl to be. Generally, less ultra low end means more volumes available to you. That's something you should talk to a pressing plant about. That's the kind of thing where each vinyl manufacturing plant will have different requirements. And of course, if you don't have a cutting lathe, then you'll need to talk to a mastering house that does. Even if you're doing your own mastering to send to them, you don't want to go crazy with it, because they may need to make other adjustments to make sure that the cutting lathe works as it's supposed to. Now, one last thing that I'll talk about is streaming. iTunes, Spotify, that kind of thing. So you've got your master and you think you're happy with it. This is where I then tend to pull the volume of a maximizer right back. I now put the ceiling of a Spotify master, iTunes master, at -2 decibels, because that's something that Spotify have been suggesting in some of their recent publications, which means there's absolutely no way that a loud master is going to go over. Now, why would I want things to be less loud for Spotify, iTunes, that kind of thing? Well, all of these systems now, YouTube included, they analyze the volume of your track. And if it's louder than a certain value, they just pull it down. Which means that anything that you lost by crushing the volume, like you could see on our maximizer earlier, it was going crazy. Anything you lost, you're never going to get back, but you're going to be quieter than some of the other people. And so that doesn't sound like a good thing to me at all. So what we want to do now is go back to our reference, add another reference, but I'm going to add in the Spotify master at this point. And I'm just going to pick, it's just going to take a minute to load, this one. And you can see how the CD master looks like it's been absolutely crushed. Spotify master, not so much. There are a few bits here where you can see where the snares and that kind of thing have touched the top, where they've hit the limiter, but they've not hit it very hard at all. So if I use this reference now, and I'm going to go back to Dither and make this 24-bit, because that's something that for streaming and compression, they would rather you have more bit depth, higher sample rate if you have it, is what I read in the iTunes mastering white paper. So if you've been working at 48k or 96 kilohertz, that's what they want. They want you to send the highest quality you have, so that then when they compress it, which they're going to, they get the most out of it. That's their argument behind it. I'm not going to argue against mastering engineers at Apple. They seem to know what they're talking about. So if we listen to our reference now. And then switch back from our reference. Cool. So that's now roughly the same in volume. It sounds clearer and punchier to me. And you can just see that the snares and the kicks are just touching the limiter like they were originally before we did all this processing, which I think's absolutely great. Now, how do we know when the volume is right? This is where I'm going to bring up Chrome, I use a website called loudnesspenalty.com. Loudnesspenalty.com is made by a guy called Ian Shepherd and his friends at Meterplugs. And this is a brilliant tool. This is a great thing to show to an artist that you're working with if they say, oh, well, I want it to be louder. So if I select a file, I'm going to select that CD master that we made. So the CD master of Give Me a Sign. And that's not uploading to them. That's literally just processing this on your machine just to work out what the volume is. So it's not sending the file anywhere. Don't worry, it's not doing anything. So what's going to happen is that YouTube's going to turn this CD master down by 4 dB. Spotify's going to turn it down by 5. iTunes, it looks like -8 roughly. So you're really getting less volume out of your master than you thought you would. And it's really going to suffer, which means that you're not getting the full range of your mix, which is why I took this -10 and just took several decibels off it and brought the ceiling down as well. So if you were to render that, let's go back to loudnesspenalty.com and where's the start again? If there is one, I know there's a start again. So if I just load up the Spotify master for that, not the one that we've just done, but I did this exact same process. So this is going to process this audio with much less limited sound, and yeah, so YouTube's not going to make it any less loud at all. It's perfectly perfect for YouTube. Spotify, Tidal are going to bring it down by 0.1 decibels, which is practically nothing. And iTunes, if they're being really conservative, are going to shave a couple of dB off it. But overall, that is our mix. Even Pandora's even going to turn it up a little bit, a tiny, tiny bit. And that means all those hits, all that punch, all that transient is being kept. And in a mastering context, I think that really is the goal, is we want to make our pieces of music, our tracks, stand up with the big boys and also have all the quality that we originally wanted, all that punch, all that hit, all that definition. We don't want to lose any of that. And because we've done it this way of taking the volume back to max out our benefits of going up against everybody else, we win the loudness war, which means that when you're up on Spotify against somebody else, yours might have more punch, it might have more hit, it might be better sounding because it's not being turned down because it's too loud. Hopefully, this little tutorial has helped you a lot. Big thanks to iZotope, who sent me Ozone 8 to do this with. I've been a big user of Ozone for years, but I've used Ozone 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8. All the new features in 8 I didn't think I needed, but the reference has been absolutely fantastic. And I'm really starting to get to grips with some of the advanced stuff now, which I might talk about in another video if I get time, because the advanced stuff is all the cool stuff for us engineers who already had some of this kind of stuff. So stuff like dynamic EQs and vintage EQs, which sound like a Pultec. So it's got that kind of really broad, really cool kind of thing going on. Really nice features, and also the advanced version has stuff like separate plugins are available for each separate one of these. If I wanted to use the stereo imager just on some guitars in a mix, for example, the advanced version gives me that. And there's a gain match, so if I bypass everything, it just makes everything sound the way that it's going to in comparison. It makes the original track louder to compare with the maximiser. So that when I bypass the plugin, I can hear what it's doing to the original track, which is kind of cool. And there's just so much going on in version 8 that wasn't there before, that if you're interested in that kind of stuff, check it out on iZotope's website. Thanks, iZotope. Thank you guys for watching. Back to me in the studio. I hope you very much enjoyed this tutorial and it's given you a lot to think about, and hopefully it's helped you to make better masters. Not to say that the mix being a separate thing wasn't something we could look at separately, and we're going to do separate videos on mixing, but I find that mixing can be a far more broad type of thing that can have a lot more character, a lot more style. So if this video was useful for you, hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel, because we've got more tutorials coming up about how to use Pro Tools, how to use Reaper properly. We've done that before, but we're doing a new set. How to mix, particularly how to mix rock, how to mix metal. There are guys that do stuff like how to mix rap, trap, hip-hop, that kind of stuff. That's not me, to be honest, but if you are interested in rock and metal mixing, those tutorials are coming very soon. There's so much more to go at. We do gear reviews for headphones, microphones, guitars, guitar amps, all sorts of stuff. So stick around, hit the subscribe button and check all that kind of stuff out. If you really enjoyed the video, maybe subscribe to us on Patreon as well, where you get early access to videos, and it really helps us out to keep the lights on and keep all this kind of thing going. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm Adam Steele for Hot Pole Studios, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.